One jeep, one mud road. Poland, April 1945. The war in Europe is almost over. Almost. Major Ernest Grunberg is sitting behind the wheel of that jeep, engine idling, watching two Soviet soldiers stand in the road ahead of him. They have rifles. He has a piece of paper. Not orders. Not official authorization. Not a document stamped and countersigned by anyone with diplomatic authority. Just a piece of paper. A few handwritten lines. One signature. George S. Patton. Grunberg has no right to be here. Not according to any protocol. Not according to the Yalta Agreement, which has very specific procedures for exactly this kind of situation. Not according to Eisenhower, who has already told Patton, more than once, to use the proper channels. The proper channels aren't working. Grunberg sits there for a moment. Engine running. Hands on the wheel. And then he hears it. English. From somewhere behind that wire fence, maybe 200 meters away, someone is speaking American English. Not German. Not Russian. American English. The war ended for the rest of the world weeks ago. Flags in Times Square. Church bells in London. Parties in every city that still had something left to celebrate. For the men behind that fence, it hasn't ended yet. Grunberg could turn around. He could drive back to 3rd Army headquarters and file a report saying the Soviet checkpoint blocked his access. He tried. They refused. Nobody would blame him. Instead, he opens the door, steps out into the mud, adjusts his uniform, and starts speaking Russian to the soldier in front of him. Not textbook Russian. Not military training Russian. The Russian his grandmother taught him at a kitchen table in Brooklyn. The Russian of a woman who left Ukraine in 1910 and never stopped speaking the language of the place she came from. He never thought that would matter. It matters today. Here is what you need to understand before this story goes any further. The men behind that fence were American soldiers. They had been prisoners of the Germans, some of them for years. They had survived the camps. They had survived the winter marches. They had survived everything the Third Reich threw at them. And then, in the early months of 1945, the Red Army swept through Poland and Eastern Germany and opened the gates. They were free. Except they weren't. They were free from the Germans. But they were not being returned to American control. The Yalta Agreement, signed just weeks earlier by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, said they should be gathered, fed, given medical care, and sent home as quickly as possible. The Soviet Union had signed that agreement. The Soviet Union was not following it. The official channels were working on it. Diplomatic notes were being exchanged. General John R. Dean at the U.S. military mission in Moscow was filing report after report, and the men behind the wire were still behind the wire. Some of them had been moved east, deeper into Soviet-controlled territory, away from home. So who was going to get them out? Not the diplomats. Not the official contact teams that kept getting turned back at checkpoints just like this one. Patton had a different answer. His answer was standing in the mud right now, holding a piece of paper with one signature on it, speaking Russian to a soldier who hadn't decided yet which way this was going to go. We'll come back to that checkpoint. But first, you need to know who these men were. The ones behind the fence. The ones nobody was supposed to leave behind. Before the story continues, if this is your first time at WW2 Untold Vault, hit subscribe right now. We tell the stories of World War II that the textbooks never had room for. The real human moments on both sides of the line. Now, back to the story. Dayton, Ohio, June 1943. Thomas H. Webb is 24 years old. He works at a garage on 5th Street. Oil changes, brake jobs, the occasional transmission, that takes all day. He is good at it. He likes the quiet logic of engines. Every problem has a reason. Every reason has a fix. He is wiping his hands on a shop rag when the mailman comes to the door. Draft notice. He reads it once, folds it, puts it in his shirt pocket, goes back to the car he was working on. That evening, at the kitchen table, his wife Mary sets down a plate of food and looks at him. She is 22. She is 3 months pregnant with their first child. She already knows. She saw the envelope on the counter. They don't talk about the letter that night. They talk about names. Boy names. Girl names. Whether the middle name should be his father's or hers. Webb has one habit that Mary will remember for the rest of her life. He whistles while he works. Never the right tune. Always the right rhythm. January 1945. a prison camp called Oflog 64 in Subin, Poland. Webb has been a prisoner since September 1944, captured during the fighting in eastern France. He has lived through one winter on short rations, barracks that were never designed to keep anyone warm, surrounded by men doing the same arithmetic he does every morning. How much longer? In the distance, to the east, Soviet artillery, getting closer every day. The men in the camp know what that sound means. It means the war is almost over. It means they are almost home. Thomas Webb has a son he has never met. James, born October 1943, 7 months after Webb shipped out. He knows the name because Mary's letter found him in the camp, 8 months late. The paper was soft as cloth from being folded and unfolded so many times. He does not know what James looks like. He does not know if the boy has his eyes or Mary's. He thinks about that. More than anything else, he thinks about that. Now, the other man you need to know. Ernest Grunberg grew up in Brooklyn, son of a tailor, grandson of a woman named Irina, who arrived from Ukraine in 1910 with a single bag. At the kitchen table, every Friday evening, Irina told stories in Russian. Grunberg listened, not because he wanted to, but because she didn't speak English well enough to tell them any other way. He joined the army in 1941, rose to major, got assigned to 3rd Army in late 1944, Patton's army. In the spring of 1945, reports started coming in about American prisoners stranded in Soviet-controlled territory. Someone at headquarters ran down the list of officers with Russian language capability. Grunberg's name came up. He carries a small notebook in his breast pocket, not a diary, a list of names, people he has been asked to find. Here is the world these two men are living inside. On February 11, 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin signed an agreement on the treatment of liberated prisoners of war. The language was clear. Allied prisoners freed by Soviet forces would be collected, fed, given medical care, and returned home as quickly as possible. By March 1945, Allied headquarters estimated the Red Army would liberate approximately 134,000 American and British prisoners from German camps in the East. 134,000 men, each one with a name, each one with someone waiting. The agreement was signed. The obligation was clear. And then the contact teams sent into Soviet-controlled territory started coming back with a different story. Access denied at checkpoints. Men told to produce documents that didn't exist. Reports of American prisoners being moved east, deeper into Soviet territory, instead of west toward home. In Moscow, General John R. Dean, head of the U.S. military mission, had been filing reports since 1944. Always the same pattern: formal cooperation, no real cooperation. Agreements made and not kept. Access promised and not given. Eisenhower knew. He was pursuing it through diplomatic channels. The diplomatic channels were producing the form of progress, without the substance of it. And the men in the camps were still in the camps. Somewhere in Poland, Thomas Webb is writing a letter he has no way to send. He writes to Mary. He writes to James. He tells James, a boy he has never seen, about the garage on 5th Street, about the sound an engine makes when you finally get it right, about how he is going to teach him to whistle, not the right tune, the right rhythm. He doesn't know if the letter will ever reach anyone. He writes it anyway, because writing it is the only way he has, right now, to believe that someone on the other side is waiting. The question this story has to answer is not complicated. It doesn't require maps or strategy or diplomatic theory. It just requires one thing: someone willing to go get them. Every official channel had been tried. Every proper procedure had been followed. The men were still there. And somewhere in a command post in central Germany, George Patton was reading a report that was about to make him do something Eisenhower had not authorized, something the Soviet military had not approved, something the Yalta Agreement had not anticipated. He was going to send someone in. March 1945, somewhere in central Germany. 3rd Army headquarters, a requisition building that still smells like whoever lived here before. Coffee gone cold. Maps covering every flat surface. Rain against the windows. Patton is standing in front of the main map when the intelligence officer walks in. He doesn't sit down to read the report. He reads it standing, coffee in one hand, eyes moving down the page. Then he puts the coffee down. The report describes what the American contact teams have been finding in Soviet-controlled territory. Teams sent in under the Yalta Agreement, officially authorized, properly documented, following every correct procedure. Turned back at checkpoints. Told to produce paperwork that didn't exist under any framework anyone had established. Informed that the prisoners had already been moved to another location. No one could say which location. The men themselves, the American prisoners freed from German camps by the Red Army, were not being moved west. Some were still in the same camps they had just been liberated from. Same barracks, same wire, different uniforms on the guards. Some were being moved east, away from home, deeper in. The medical care the Yalta Agreement required was not being provided at any adequate level. The food was short, and the timeline for getting these men home, which the agreement said should be as fast as possible, was being determined by a Soviet administrative process that had no particular urgency about what fast means. Patton has been at war long enough to know the difference between a system that is failing and a system that has been told not to succeed. This was not a failure. This was a decision. He could take it to Eisenhower. He had already taken it to Eisenhower. Eisenhower was pursuing it through the diplomatic channels that ran from his headquarters up through the American government and across to the Soviet command. General John R. Dean in Moscow was sending the same cables he had been sending since late 1944. Formal cooperation. No real cooperation. The pattern was consistent. The results were not changing. Eisenhower understood what Patton understood. But Eisenhower was also managing something Patton was not. The Red Army and Third Army were converging on the Elbe River. Two massive forces moving toward each other through the wreckage of the Third Reich. The coordination required for that final phase, the communication, the deconfliction, the management of two armies operating in the same shrinking space. All of it depended on a functional relationship with the Soviet command. A direct confrontation over prisoner treatment at this moment had costs that Eisenhower could not ignore. Patton could see the logic. He didn't accept it. The men in those camps had already done everything that was asked of them. They had fought. They had been captured. They had survived years of German captivity. They had waited through one more winter on the promise that the Red Army's advance meant liberation. And now they were being told by the machinery of diplomacy to wait a little longer. Patton had visited enough men coming back from those camps to know what a little longer costs. He made a decision. He did not announce it. There was no meeting. No memo sent up the chain. He called Grunberg in. The room was quiet when they met. No aides. No other officers. Just Patton, the map on the wall, a lamp throwing uneven light across the table, and the sound of rain outside. Patton pointed to the map. The hatched zone east of the current front, Soviet-controlled territory, marked in the cautious, bureaucratic language of headquarters staff. He didn't explain the geopolitics. He didn't walk through the diplomatic history. He said, "Go find our people. Bring them back." Grunberg looked at the map. Then he asked the obvious question. "What do I show them if they ask for authorization?" Patton pulled a sheet of paper toward him, wrote several lines, signed it, pushed it across the table. That. Grunberg looked at the paper. It had no official stamp, no countersignature, no authorization code recognized by any Soviet military protocol. It had a name at the bottom. One name. He folded it, put it in his breast pocket, next to the notebook, with the list of names. Didn't ask anything else. Patton watched him go. He knew what was coming. When Grunberg crossed into Soviet-controlled territory without authorization, there would be complaints. Those complaints would reach Eisenhower. Eisenhower would send word to operate through established channels. Patton had been calculating the same equation since he read the report. On one side, the diplomatic relationship, the proper channels, the chain of command, and the risk of complicating the final weeks of the war. On the other side, men in camps who had already waited too long, in conditions the Yalta Agreement had promised would not exist. He had made his calculation. Outside, the rain had not let up. Grunberg walked across the courtyard to where his jeep was parked, collar up against the weather. He didn't look back. In his pocket, the list of names. In his pocket, the paper with one signature. In his mind, the distance between here and wherever those men were. He would leave before dawn. No escort. No support structure. No plan B. If the paper in his pocket turned out to mean nothing to the people he was going to meet, just a jeep, a list of names, and the Russian his grandmother taught him at a kitchen table in Brooklyn. The same rain that was falling on Third Army headquarters was falling on Subin, Poland. Thomas Webb was lying on his bunk, listening to it. He had been in Soviet custody for weeks now. No word of repatriation. No contact from any American representative. Just the same arithmetic. The same question. How much longer? He didn't know that someone had just been sent to answer it. He didn't know the name Ernest Grunberg. He didn't know about the piece of paper, or the notebook, or the kitchen table in Brooklyn. He just knew the rain, and the dark, and the waiting. Grunberg crossed into Soviet-controlled territory before dawn. No escort, no radio contact with anyone who could help him if things went wrong. The road was mud and broken stone, the kind of road that a war leaves behind when it moves on. The first checkpoint appeared out of the gray morning like something that had always been there. A barrier across the road. 2 soldiers. One lantern still burning even, though the sky was getting light. Grunberg stopped the jeep, got out, didn't reach for the paper in his pocket yet. He spoke first, in Russian, not the careful Russian of a language course. The Russian of Friday evenings in Brooklyn, of a grandmother who made tea too strong and told stories too long and never once apologized for either. The soldier in front of him was young. 19, maybe 20. He had the look of someone who had been standing at checkpoints long enough to stop being surprised by anything. His name, though Grunberg would never know it, was Alexei. He was from Kharkov. He had walked from Stalingrad to here across 3 winters. Alexei listened to Grunberg's Russian without expression. Then he asked for documents. Grunberg gave him the paper. Alexei read it. Read it again. It was clear, from his face, that the paper meant nothing inside any framework he had been given. Then Grunberg asked his question. Are there Americans here? Alexei said nothing. He looked at Grunberg for a long moment. Then his eyes moved, just slightly, just for a second, to the left, toward a low building about 200 meters down a side road, half hidden by trees. Then he looked straight ahead again, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't moved at all. Grunberg understood. He nodded once, not at the checkpoint, not at the barrier. At Alexei, at the man. He said thank you. In Russian, Alexei kept his eyes forward. But something in his posture shifted. Almost nothing. Almost invisible. Almost enough. There are moments in war when 2 men on opposite sides of a line recognize something in each other. Not agreement. Not friendship. Just the simple acknowledgement that both of them are standing in the same cold morning, carrying orders from people far away, trying to get through the day without anyone dying unnecessarily. This was one of those moments. Neither of them would ever speak of it. Neither of them needed to. The building down the side road was a former farm storage facility. Concrete floor, wooden roof, a stove that worked only some of the time. 23 American soldiers inside. Some were standing when Grunberg walked in. Some were lying down. All of them looked at him the same way. The way men look at something they are not sure is real yet. Webb was near the back wall. Thinner than his enlistment photo would have shown. Beard. Eyes that had learned not to expect much. He was the first one to speak. He didn't ask if they were being rescued. He didn't ask when they were leaving. He asked, "My son, do you know what his name is?" Grunberg stopped. He had walked through a checkpoint with no valid authorization. He had navigated Soviet military bureaucracy on nothing but a signature and a borrowed language. He had found 23 men in a building that officially did not exist in any American report. And he had no answer to this question. He sat down on the floor next to Webb, not because there was something useful to do there, because it was the only honest response he had. "I don't know, but we're going to get you home to find out." Webb looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. Once. Slowly. The way a man nods when he decides to believe something again after a long time of not believing anything. Getting 23 men out was not one trip. Grunberg moved them in groups, working back and forth across the checkpoint, using the same Russian and the same paper each time. The paper got more worn with each crossing. The Russian got more tired. Neither stopped working. At the 3rd checkpoint, a Soviet officer of higher rank stopped him, demanded proper documentation, told him the paper he was carrying had no standing under any established protocol. Grunberg said, "I know, but these men are American. They fought on the same side as you. They want to go home." The officer read the paper again, looked at the men in the jeep, looked at Grunberg. He stood there for a long time. Long enough that it was a decision, not a reflex. Then he stepped aside. Said nothing. Just stepped aside. While Grunberg was moving people west, a Soviet military complaint was moving east, up, through channels, toward Eisenhower's headquarters. Unauthorized American activities in Soviet-controlled territory. Request that the American command instruct its personnel to use established procedures. Eisenhower sent word to Patton. Use the proper channels. Patton read the message. Set it down. Looked at the map. At the place where Grunberg was. He did not send word to stop. The officer on his staff, who was standing nearby, when he read the message would remember this later. Not what Patton said. What he didn't say. 3 days after the complaint reached Eisenhower's desk, Grunberg brought the last of the 23 men across to Third Army lines. Webb was in the final group. When they arrived, the Army doctors moved quickly. The language in the medical reports was short and factual: malnutrition, untreated infections, exhaustion. The kind of language that covers, in a few clinical words, what months of captivity actually costs a human body. Grunberg filed his report that evening. He wrote what he had seen in the Soviet-controlled areas. The conditions, the locations, the gap between what the Yalta Agreement had promised these men and what they had actually received. 3 days later he was informed that the report had been classified. He asked why. No one answered. He didn't ask again. He already knew why. A true account, arriving at the wrong moment, doesn't get refuted. It gets buried. The notebook stayed in his pocket. 23 names. 23 lines of ink drawn through in blue. All of them going home. And somewhere on a road moving west, through the ruins of the war, Thomas Webb was sitting in the back of a truck, looking at his hands. Thinking about a garage on 5th Street. About a boy named James, who was almost 2 years old. About whether a boy, that age, could already be taught to whistle. Not the right tune. The right rhythm. The weeks that followed were quieter than the weeks that came before. Grunberg went back in more than once. Different roads. Different checkpoints. The same worn paper. The same Russian. Each time, more names crossed out in the notebook. Each time, men arriving at Third Army lines in the condition that months of German captivity and weeks of Soviet custody produces. The Army doctors used words like malnutrition and untreated infection. The men themselves mostly didn't use words at all, not at first. They ate. They slept. They asked about home. Patton visited some of them in the field hospital. No photographers. No official record of the visits. He walked through the wards, and he looked at the men, and he didn't say much. There was one soldier, no one wrote down his name, who reached up and took Patton's hand and held it. Patton stood there and let him. Didn't pull away. Didn't speak. Just stood there. On the ride back to headquarters, Patton said nothing for the entire journey. His aide, who had been with him long enough to know the difference between his silences, didn't try to fill it. Thomas Webb arrived home in late June 1945, 6 weeks after V-Day, 6 weeks after the rest of the world had already finished celebrating. Mary was at the door before he reached the porch. She didn't say anything either. Some reunions don't need words. Some of them are just two people standing in the same place at the same time, after too long apart. James was inside, almost 2 years old. He came to the doorway and looked at Webb the way small children look at strangers. Carefully, seriously, deciding. Webb didn't reach for him. He sat down on the floor of the hallway. Put himself at eye level. Let James make the choice. James looked at him for a long time. Then he walked over. Sat down next to him on the floor. Put his hand on Webb's arm. That was all. That was everything. Grunberg filed his full report. It was classified within days. He requested an explanation. None came. He understood, without being told, that a clear account of what had happened to American prisoners in Soviet custody was not a document the government was ready to circulate. Not in June 1945. Not with the post-war relationship, with Moscow still being negotiated. Not when the official position was still that the Yalta Agreement had been largely a success. It had not been a success. Not for all of them. Because not all of the names in Grunberg's notebook were crossed out. The majority of American prisoners liberated by the Red Army were eventually returned, through the combination of diplomatic pressure and the operations Patton had authorized without approval. But not all. The accounting was never complete. There were men whose fate was recorded in Soviet archives that were never opened. Men who appeared in German camp records as alive in early 1945 and then simply stopped appearing in any record at all. In 1992, nearly 50 years after the war ended, Russian President Boris Yeltsin sent a letter to the United States Senate. He acknowledged that not all American citizens had been returned home after World War II. 1992. 47 years. The relevant archives have still not been fully opened. General Patton was relieved as military governor of Bavaria on September 28, 1945. He had said publicly what American policy was not ready to say, that the Soviet system emerging in Eastern Europe was not a different form of civilization, but a threat that the next generation would spend decades managing. 10 days later, he was relieved of command of Third Army. On December 9, 1945, he was critically injured in a car accident near Mannheim. He died 12 days later in a hospital in Heidelberg. December 21, 1945. He did not live to see the Cold War confirm everything he had said. He did not live to see the Truman Doctrine, or the Berlin Airlift, or the decades of tension he had described in the spring of 1945, when no one wanted to hear it. He was right. He was just right too early. There is a particular kind of loneliness in that. In seeing something clearly that the people around you are not ready to see. In making a decision you know is correct and paying the price for it anyway. In sending a man into Soviet-controlled territory with a piece of paper and a borrowed language, and knowing, when the complaints arrive, that you are not going to stop him. Patton didn't save all of them. No one did. The system that was supposed to save them, the agreement, the contact teams, the diplomatic channels, fell short of what it promised. But some of them came home because he sent someone to get them. Not through channels. Not with authorization. Not with approval from anyone who had the authority to give it. Just a man, with a list of names, speaking his grandmother's language at a checkpoint in Poland, in the gray light of an April morning. The notebook stayed with Grunberg for the rest of his life. He kept it in a drawer, not on display. The names crossed out in blue ink. The names that weren't. He never talked about it much. Men of that generation often didn't. They came home, they went back to work, they raised families, and they carried what they had seen in the places they kept things that were too heavy to put down and too important to let go. Somewhere in Dayton, Ohio, Thomas Webb taught his son James to whistle. Not the right tune, the right rhythm. If your father or your grandfather came home late from the war, weeks after V-Day, without a clear explanation, he may have been one of the men this story is about. The families were never told exactly what had happened. Many of them are still not sure. If this story answered something you've wondered about for a long time, leave a comment below. And if you want to keep hearing the stories that didn't make it into the history books, the real ones, about real people, subscribe to WW2 Untold Vault. We'll be here.